Lord of the Oasis. Chapter 1, Journey in the Desert. Kant shook the reins in his hand for a bit as he steered the horse he was riding forward. To the east of the Naran Desert, the morning sun was steadily rising. It hung high at the top of the endless dunes, exuding its might to dispel the chill of night. Scorching heat waves washed over the barren desert. Except for the Jackalans, who had no concept of civilization, no other races were willing to step foot into that barren place. That, of course, excluded Kent and his team. 20 knights, who wore mail armor under their robes, were riding war horses. There were also 30 peasants, who served as servants. Right behind Kent were 6 horses pulling carriages with goods. Hurrah-fetch! Kent sighed a heavy breath and frowned as he looked forward at the winding dunes. He flipped the hood on his linen robe over. His blonde hair draped over his shoulders. His young, supple face was plastered with dust. His amber eyes contracted, making them look harsh as he rode. They were in the Naran Desert, a world filled with sand and dust. It was a wasteland that had yet to be developed. Before the place was conquered by the Dukedom of Leo 10 years ago, the desert had no signs of civilization. As for the Jackalan tribes, they were primitive beings that ate their prey raw along with the blood and fur. There was no doubt that the Jackalans remained the same even until now. As the youngest son of the Duke, Kant naturally understood that the desert was not considered part of the Dukedom of Leo. Even though the Dukedom had conquered the entire southern area of the Naran Desert 10 years ago, in truth, the upper echelons had only claimed to have taken the place with empty talk. Most scholars within the dukedom did not acknowledge that the conquest had even happened. On the map, the border of the dukedom remained at the Sinway range right next to the Naran Desert. The endless desert north of there remained unoccupied by civilization. Those areas had been taken over by the Jackalan tribes, so the place remained incapable of being used for herding or farming, which practically made it useless. Even criminals and escaped slaves from the dukedom, who were at their wits' end, would not go to such a place. This is pathetic. Kant shook his head and humbly smirked as he thought, I actually ended up in a *thole like this. If it had not been for the fact that he had run out of options, he would not have stepped into the barren desert in the first place. Furthermore, it was still summer. The sun in June was like a bakery oven. Even the morning sun was capable of heating the entire desert to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Kant looked up at the sky. The sun above the dunes continued to rise. During this season in the barren desert, noon temperatures could reach 158 degrees Fahrenheit, which was a temperature no one could withstand. It is so hot. He gulped a mouthful of sticky saliva and adjusted the breathable linen hood. His frown turned even more serious as he moved. He hastened the horse before turning around to the team behind him and shouting, "Move it, people! Hurry up! If you don't want to end up being toasted under the sun at noon, we need to set up camp to rest before noon." "Yes, sir." Lethargic responses were heard. The peasants pushed the carriages, making them go faster. They were all traveling on foot. With 3 carriages full of supplies, the team's speed was abhorrent. The wheels of the carriages, which were crafted using hardwood and nails, were better suited to roads on the flatlands of the Dukedom of Leo. The wheels dredged through the soft sands, causing even the stout horses to neigh in exhaustion. Every step they took was difficult because the wheels kept getting stuck in the sand, requiring the peasants to push the wheels to be able to move even slightly faster. Kant understood their predicament. He sighed seeing the team behind him move. "This is awful." Kant frowned. "Your lordship." Rowan, the captain of the knights riding behind him, rode up to Kant's side. That middle-aged man, who was usually steadfast, looked rather anxious as he said, "Pardon my rudeness, but we'd really like to know how long it will take before we reach the Oasis lookout." "How long?" Kant looked calm and kept his eyes on the winding, endless dunes ahead. He gritted his teeth before saying, "I have no idea." Well, Rowan looked even more anxious after hearing the answer. That was apparently not what he had hoped to hear. The corner of Kant's mouth rose slightly. However, there was hardly any emotion seen on his calm face as he plainly said, "According to the calculations, we've been traveling for 6 days. If the map and route are correct, we'll reach our destination soon enough." "We'll reach soon enough." Rowan gulped, feeling his throat hurt from being so parched. They had been marching through the desert for 6 days. Everyone had reached their physical and psychological limits. They had had enough. That was especially so regarding the storage of fresh water. That day, it had hit the red line. 51 people and 27 horses needed their thirst quenched. That was one of the reasons why Rowan was so anxious. He and the 20 knights he commanded, who all served as escorts, were allowed to leave as soon as they reached their destination. They did not need to stay with Kant and the 30 peasants. The sooner they reached the Oasis lookout, the sooner they would leave the dreaded desert behind and return home. On the contrary, Kant hardly minded any of it. Even when they reached the Oasis lookout, the destination at the end of the route was not something to be happy about. It was where he would likely stay for the rest of his days, surrounded by an endless swath of sand. He recalled the title he gained at his coming-of-age ceremony and sarcastically smirked. A fief was granted alongside the title. Boy, this is hilarious. However, his eyes were only filled with coldness. He was a baron of the dukedom, which was why he had a territory of his own. It was conferred by his father, Cameron, the Duke of the Dukedom of Leo, personally. He gave the Naran Desert, which had been conquered 10 years ago, to Kant for him to reign over as its master. That included their destination, the Oasis lookout, which was the only oasis that could be found in the southern parts of the desert. Kant was a baron in name but lord of the Naran Desert. However, no one knew that the place was simply a prison where Duke Cameron exiled his least favorite and youngest son. Then again, desert or not, I have my way of getting by. The sarcasm seen in Kant's eyes became even more pronounced. As someone who was transported to his current world from Earth, Kant had his trump card, which served as a cheat in that world. So be it. Kant narrowed his eyes and looked ahead. A dialog box from the system appeared on his retina. Main quest, build a village. Reward, 1,000 dinars. Status, incomplete. Introduction, you can only become a lord by having a village. That is the first step to constructing your foundation. Please be careful. That was the main quest given by the system. He needed to see to its completion since it was tied to leveling up in the system. It was actually simple to complete the main quest. As long as Kant was able to get to the Oasis lookout and have the 20 knights of the dukedom return home, he could rely on the powers bestowed by the system to build his village, bringing the buildings that only existed within the system to reality. The village was but the beginning. As things progressed, the place could be upgraded to a huge city or a sturdy castle. In the past, Kant was concerned that he would have no place to establish his village. At present, after traveling through the natural border separating the Naran Desert and Dukedom of Leo, the Sinway Range, Kant found that he no longer had to live under constant scrutiny as he had once been, always afraid of having his cover as a transported and his cheat blown. He did not need to think about where to materialize the village from the system quest. The Dukedom of Leo was a conventional nation of the Middle Ages. The flatlands of the entire nation had all been taken. Be it the hills, forests, marshes, or jungles, all of them had been taken by the nobles as their fiefs and estates. The Dukedom of Leo had been established for nearly 300 years. Whether it was the greater nobles or the lesser nobles titled by the greater nobles, all of them had taken whatever land there was to take. The ranks of counts, viscounts, and barons had been firmly established throughout the years. A new village that popped out of nowhere was tantamount to a failed investment. It was easy to establish a village, but it was another thing altogether deciding who would eventually rule the place. Furthermore, none of the nobles would have allowed such a lucrative piece of land to slip through their fingers, even if the father of the one who built the place was the duke. The vassal of my vassal is not my vassal. That was a renowned phrase from the western parts of Earth, which could have been applied to this situation. As such, Kant was very careful with his main quest. If he were to lose his village, he would lose everything. He dared to gamble, but he dared not be careless. That remained his attitude, even at present as he was making his way to the Oasis lookout in the Naran desert. Kant knew that only the things he truly had command over would be his. Thus, Kant had agreed to take the Naran desert as his fief. Things are going to better once we reach the Oasis lookout. Kant clenched his fists slightly. His breathing became more labored. However, he was actually very spirited. He turned around to look behind him. The 30 peasants, who wore cheap linen clothing, were exhausted and drenched in sweat from pushing the carriages. They looked to be of little difference from common peasants' subjects who were following their lord to his new fief. In truth, that was not the case. The 30 peasants were a reward given to Kant when he finished a side quest after coming to that world. They were Kingdom of Swadia peasants given to him by the system. Despite looking rather malnourished and appearing frail, all of them were around 5 feet 9 inches tall and stronger than their looks suggested. They excelled at working the fields and were laborers that any workshop would have fought over to hire. Then again, being from the system, they were more than just average peasants. If Kant provided the necessary training, including corresponding weapons and equipment, they could also become fine soldiers. It was just like the leveling tree of the game, mount and blade. They could be upgraded to become reliable main infantry forces Swadian sergeants who were like walking fortresses. They could be upgraded to become excellent ranged attack units Swadian sharpshooters armed with crossbows. They could be upgraded to become Swadian knights armed in 2 layers of armor as they rode horses. That was the unit known to be the supreme troop class on land. These people will serve as my foundation from here on out. Kant quietly muttered to himself. His eyes glimmered with hope once again. He sat upright as he rode, gazing at the faraway dune. He encouraged both the peasants and knights behind him. Keep it up, people. We can take a break at that dune at the horizon before us. Hooray! The peasants cheered in a high-spirited manner. Yes, hooray! The knights of the dukedom responded lethargically. If it had not been for Captain Rowan telling them that they were about to reach their destination, none of them would have probably been in the mood to even talk. At the same time, those knights were looking at the Swadian peasants like they were idiots. They were unable to fathom why those lowly, poor peasants had come to the barren desert. Furthermore, they all looked very high-spirited as if they had high hopes for the future. The knights thought the peasants were hilarious. Hope? Scorching heat, freezing cold, all manners of negative words and terms could have been used to describe the Naran desert. The word hope had no place there. They are indeed some ridiculous fools. Rowan eyed the peasants with cold eyes. None of them understood that the Swadian peasants existed only because Kant existed. Rowan looked at Kant and felt contempt in his heart. You're about to end up dead here, yet you actually brought that many with you. Does your lordship really think that you're a lord of the Naran desert, the master of the Oasis lookout? He struggled to hold back his laughter at the thought. None of it had anything to do with him. As soon as they reached their destination, Rowan and his men would immediately leave. They would not have even a moment of hesitation to stay behind. In truth, those were not Rowan's thoughts alone. All of the dukedom nobles shared such thoughts. None of them thought there were any prospects to be had in the Oasis, which had an area less than 3,229 square miles. Furthermore, in the barren desert, the scorching heat of the day and the freezing cold of the night were not the only threats to humans. The threat included those who had once been driven away and slaughtered but had never truly left the Naran desert. The Jackalan tribes. Chapter 2, The Jackalan's Ambush. The Jackalans were the most common humanoid race found in the Naran desert. They once had a massive population that stretched across the Naran desert to the Sinway range. During the many years the dukedom was at war with other dukedoms, the Jackalans had taken advantage of the situation and invaded the dukedom's northern lands. They remained a solid threat to the dukedom for nearly 3 years. They were considered as a disgusting inflammation that seemed to spread all the way to the central regions. When the dukedom of Leo was done warring against the other dukedoms, they immediately sought to purge the Jackalans from their lands. The massive purge lasted for a year. The Jackalan tribes, which behaved as if they had reached paradise when they first invaded the dukedom, were quickly crushed by the retaliation. The Jackalans had no high-grade weapons or armor, which meant that they were no match for the human forces. The Jackalans were easily killed by the cavalry units, which were highly regarded by the dukedom of Leo and a source of great pride. It was said that the number of chopped Jackalan heads 10 years ago was enough to line both sides of the road. The brutal purge quickly spiraled to become an all-out genocide, stretching from the northern border of the dukedom into the southern parts of the Naran Desert. The main Jackalan tribes, which had greater numbers, almost became extinct from the genocide. Any surviving Jackalan tribes moved into the desert north of the dukedom in fear. There were still some scattered pockets of them left. There were quite a number of Jackalan tribes within the Sinway range, which was evident from how the northern villages of the dukedom were sporadically raided by Jackalans. As for the southern parts of the Naran Desert, the Jackalan numbers likely spiked from having gained a 10-year respite. There's no going back now. Kant wetted his parched, cracked lips. His expression was filled with resolve. He was determined to build his village after making the arduous journey through the desert. With the system's kingdom of Swadia as his cheat, he was determined not to fall into a state of having absolutely nothing. The dunes, which were recently discussed, were right in front of them. That was where they were about to set up camp. The plan was to set up tents in the shade behind the dune. All right, you people, get busy. The knights were still under Rowan's command. He went on to carry out his arrangements for them. Search the perimeter thoroughly. I don't want any Jackalan or beast chewing up my innards while I'm asleep. The 20 knights immediately spread out after receiving his orders. However, some hardly bothered with the task they had been given. They had been marching for 6 days and not seen any Jackalans around. As such, the knights were not very thorough with their search. After confirming that there was nothing out of the ordinary within the vicinity of the dunes, they all returned to set up tents so they could get some much-needed rest. Get the tents up. Kant arranged for the peasants to get to work as well. The 3 carriages included supplies to set up camp. There were more than a dozen tents, as well as sticks and ropes for erecting them. Some of the peasants were quickly digging into the sand with their sickles. They were removing sand about 11 inches down from the surface, revealing the cooler layers underneath. That was one of the tricks of living in the desert. Lying down inside the sand enabled them to escape the heat. It was a technique employed by the Jackalans surviving in the desert, which was picked up by the soldiers of the dukedom of Leo. The technique was, in turn, recorded by scholars in the books they wrote. Before Kant ventured into the desert, he had looked up all kinds of books on the Naran Desert and thoroughly read them. 20 tents were set up over the recently dug holes in the sand. The tents were erected with sticks and fixed in place with ropes. All 51 people in the entourage were able to have a good rest within the camp, as well as the 27 horses. I'll leave the rest to you, Rowan. Kant stood before his small tent and sighed a breath of relief. The hardest part of the work needed to set up camp had been completed. Rowan nodded in reply. Yes, your lordship. The work after required feeding and watering the horses. People were also assigned to prepare lunch and distribute water throughout the day to everyone present. While the job was relatively easy, it had to be taken seriously. No one was better suited for the job than Rowan, who was careful and steadfast. The tents blocked the sun, and the shallow holes brought coolness from the earth. Kant spread out a linen sheet and laid down. He felt as if all the exhaustion from the difficult journey was disappearing. It might actually be best to have a pint of lager at such a moment, he thought. Kant closed his eyes and sighed. I wonder when I can start living easily again. He was, at the moment, at the stage of starting from scratch. Lager was basically a luxury at such times. There was no way he could have drunk some anyway. No trade caravans traveled to the Oasis lookout to sell cheap liquor to their fief. After all, they were in the Naran desert. It was a barren wasteland where no humans were usually found. Kant shook his head and stopped thinking about it. He sniffed for a bit and smelled the fragrance of food from outside the tent. It was lunchtime. Just as Kant was preparing to take a nap in the hole, the familiar chime of the system prompt woke him up. A dialog box appeared on his retina at the same time. Ding, side quest assigned. Side quest, the Jackalan's ambush. Reward, date palm trees x20, ripe. Introduction, the smell of cooking attracted a group of Jackalans with a keen sense of smell. You need to annihilate them. Kant immediately rose from his hole. He looked determined since it was a side quest from the system, which was assigned irregularly and at no set time. However, such a side quest from the system did verify something important. There was a group of Jackalans with unknown numbers preparing for an ambush around the dunes where they were camping. Furthermore, the Jackalans had found them and were ready to strike at any moment. We've been careless. Kant was exasperated by the knight's inability to properly scout. Given how he had no command over them, there was no way he could have given them orders. He swiftly walked out of his tent. There were more than a dozen peasants still preparing lunch outside. As for the knights assigned by the dukedom to escort them, they were all burrowed in their tents and holes. There was not so much as a scout found anywhere outside of the tents. They had very much let their guards down. Kant frowned hard at the situation. If it had not been for the system prompt, those Jackalans would have probably gotten right beside the tents and remained unseen. He did not make a big deal out of it. Kant came to the side of the carriage and found his box. Within it were a light crossbow and a quiver with 20 short, thick iron bolts. He needed to be the one who discovered the Jackalans. Otherwise, there was no way he could explain how he knew the Jackalans were about to attack. Despite being somewhat of a scholar, he was certainly not a mage who possessed mystical powers. Along with 3 Swadian peasants, he swiftly walked to the top of the dunes above their campsite. He cautiously squatted as he scanned his surroundings. Over there. I found them. A peasant noticed them first. He continued to speak in a subdued voice as he pointed northward. Look, Jackalans. Many of them. Yet. Kant nodded. Approximately half of a mile north of the dunes where they were camping, they were about 50 Jackalans wearing ragged clothing and snooping about. They laid low as if they were out hunting. Actually, they were hunting. After all, human meat was often found on the menu of some of the more brutal Jackalans. Fall back. Wake everyone up and prepare for combat. Kant slowly backed away while remaining in a squatting position. Although he still looked very serious, his expression had considerably lightened. From the looks of it, more than 50 Jackalans seemed like a lot. They were almost equal to Kant's entourage. In actual fact, they were not all that much of a threat. All 20 of the dukedom's knights, who were still resting in their tents in the sand, would have been able to quickly take care of the Jackalans. Furthermore, they would have done so without incurring huge losses. Seasoned knights with ample training could have easily dealt with those primitive humanoid races. Kant quickly ran down the dune as he held onto his light crossbow. He said, Captain Rowan, we're in trouble. Please get everyone to prepare for combat. About 50 Jackalans are about to ambush our camp. Jackalans. Captain Rowan sounded rather surprised. The 20 knights in their tents quickly grabbed their weapons and emerged with stern expressions. When they scanned the surrounding dunes, they did not find anything out of the ordinary. Rowan did not doubt Kant and asked, Your Lordship, where are they? Over there, and they'll hit us real soon, Kant said as he pointed north of the dunes. Get on your horses and get ready to fight. Rowan gritted his teeth and glared at the knights behind him. He quickly berated them. Damn it, you 4 will spend the night polishing everyone's boots. I told you to scout the area, yet you missed that many Jackalans out there. The 4 knights looked glum, but they did not retort. It had truly been their mistake. The four of them were tasked with scouting to the north. Your lordship, I apologize for the matter, but we will deal with the Jackalans. Rowan led the knights to mount their horses. They all took their lances and long swords along. He turned to Kant and seriously said, "We will all deploy, so we probably will not be able to cover for you. Please be careful, your lordship." "No problem." Kant nodded. The knights were never meant for defense. They would head out and hit the Jackalans head on. Once an ambush was discovered, the element of surprise was gone. Seeing the 20 knights, led by Rowan, quickly go up the dunes and head north, Kant gave his orders. "Everyone, prepare for combat. Follow my lead." "Understood." The 30 Swadian peasants unanimously responded. While their main job was to work in the fields, they were no strangers to combat. Their specially modified sickles were mounted on 6-foot 5-inch staffs, making long scythes that resembled halberds. The weapons were capable of stabbing and slashing. Although they seemed unwieldy, they were weapons capable of dealing massive damage. Furthermore, the 30 Swadian peasants held their long scythes and went into 2 square formations. After this battle, some of them were likely to get an upgrade. Kant took the Swadian peasants to the top of the dunes. Approximately 650 feet away, the 20 dukedom knights were thrusting their lances, which were over 6 feet long, and charging without fear at the ragtag band of Jackalans. "Glory to the dukedom of Leo!" The knights shouted their motto as the war horses beneath them galloped at high speeds. Although the sand limited their absolute speed, the charge of the knights caught the Jackalans by surprise. The Jackalans were the dominant beings in the Naran desert. That emboldened them enough to sneak up to the place where they smelled something nice, even though they had no idea who they would be up against. When they saw the ones charging down the dunes were human knights, all of them began to scatter in fear. The slaughter from 10 years ago was still fresh in their memories. Chapter 3, Swadian Recruit. The afternoon sun was scorching hot. The breeze felt more like a heat wave. But this place was the Naran desert. The scorching heat made the stench of blood all around seem even thicker. It was as if a slaughter was being carried out. The 50 Jackalans, which had long, pointy tusks growing out of their lower jaws and grey fur all over their bodies, held their beast-like heads high and screeched in despair. They swung their spiked clubs at the 20 incoming knights. The dukedom of Leo knights charged from the top of the dunes just as ferociously with their lances thrust forward. It was a head-on, no-frills clash between the forces on both sides. The Jackalan tribes of the Naran desert had always been sworn enemies of the dukedom of Leo. Both sides allowed their hatred and enmity to go to their heads, removing all forms of logic and reasoning. However, as blood was being spilled everywhere, one Jackalan after another was sent flying by the charging war horses as they screeched. Their chests caved in as blood burst from their fang-filled mouths. The screeches of insanity quickly turned into whelps of struggle. "The great Edmund, the god of war, is watching us." Rowan, the captain of the knights, pierced through a Jackalan and nailed the being onto the soft sands, yet he did not stop there. He drew his long sword and began to shout in fierce encouragement, "For the dukedom of Leo, charge! Charge!" The other knights responded to his call and shouted along with him. The dukedom of Leo worshipped Edmund, the god of war, and that was the most common prayer of the warrior faith. However, that single line drove the knights into a frenzy as they charged into the Jackalans, bringing down their long swords left and right at the bestial beings. The stench of blood permeated the place they trod. The battle was intense but short. Dead bodies soon littered the place. Blood spilled from their wounds. It seeped into the sand, staining the area red. The dukedom of Leo knights, which clearly emerged as victors, did not stop slaughtering. They went on to split up and chase down all of the scattered Jackalans trying to escape. They wanted to kill them all and prevent further troubles. Only 4 or 5 Jackalans became panicked enough to run into the middle of the Swadian peasants, intending to make a breakthrough. They were quickly struck down by the long scythes wielded by the peasants, preventing them from even getting close to escaping. While the Swadian peasants were more versed in farming, they still knew basic fighting concepts. In the game, the continent of Karadia had been dominated by war for decades. Bandits and marauders were everywhere, forcing the peasants to learn how to craft makeshift weapons with the tools they depended on to make a living. Furthermore, the long scythe wielders were gathered in a tight formation, making even knights reluctant to barge into them head-on. The battle was over. The sound of the system prompt appeared in Kant's mind at the same time. Ding, all enemies are downed after the slaughter. Side quest, ambush the Jackalans is completed. Reward acquired, date palm trees x20, ripe. Comment, this was a furious and exhilarating battle. Although the battle was fought by your allies, it was your victory, nonetheless. Kant smirked exasperatedly and ignored the system's comment. There was nothing he could have done about it. If it had not been for the 20 dukedom of Leo knights, massive casualties would have been incurred if he had only been able to rely on his 30 Swadian peasants. Half of them would have died without even being close to annihilating the Jackalans. 20 date palm trees? A dialog box automatically appeared on Kant's retina with images of the trees on it. The 32-foot-tall trees were straight and had lush green leaves. Clusters of dates were on the trees, which looked huge and sweet. Being packed tight against one another made them look appetizing. There was no way conventional crops could have been planted in a desert. The date palm trees, on the other hand, were known for their hardy resistance to both cold and heat, which made them the most reliable food source in the desert. The months between October and February were the time when the dates ripened. The dates served as a staple food of desert-dwelling races, earning them the title of desert bread. As the lord of the Naran desert, Kant needed those trees more than anyone else. While he was still savoring their ultimate victory, a dialog box suddenly appeared. Ding, your forces have upgradable units. Kant's eyes lit up. Upgradable units? He quickly opened the system interface. The interface displayed 30 images representing the 30 Swadian peasants with the symbol plus, signifying that they were ready to level up. It was not an elaboration of the system quest. It was a reward acquired from the battle. Upgradable troop class, Swadian peasants x10. Spend 10 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian recruits. The system showed 2 dialog boxes after that. 100 dinars was still within budget. Kant muttered without hesitation, system, level up right away. This was a vital upgrade that was necessary. Only Swadian recruits gained after the upgrade would truly be able to serve as combatant units. Despite being the weakest troop class there was, they were still noticeably more capable than the Swadian peasants. As Kant confirmed his decision, some mystical being instantly shrouded 10 Swadian peasants by his side. Many changes were seen on the 10 peasants after that. Some type of data chain, which only Kant was able to see, circled them. Their 5 foot 9 inch statures did not change, yet they looked considerably more buff. The equipment they carried was the most pronounced among the changes. Their linen robes became leather armor, which sported better defenses, while their hoods became leather hats. The long scythes they held became standardized spears. All of them were 7.5 feet long, which made them comparable to lances wielded by the dukedom of Leo knights. Shields made of simple wooden materials appeared on their backs. Hand axes could now be seen on their waists. The 10 Swadian recruits finally cast off their peasant-like appearances and became true soldiers. I finally got my fighting force. Kant sighed a breath of relief. The 10 Swadian recruits were only the beginning. Troop classes of higher levels awaited. At present, he no longer needed to depend entirely on the dukedom knights. They would leave right after escorting them to the Oasis lookout without the slightest thought of staying behind. Your lordship, they are all taken care of. Rowan returned with his knights after Kant was done leveling up his troops. He was rather surprised to find the 10 Swadian recruits armed with spears. Rowan glanced at their shields and leather armors and asked, "Where did these people come from?" The desert is a dangerous place. It's just sensible to have more weapons just in case. Kant did not elaborate. Rowan nodded, showing that he understood. He did not ask any further questions. He was able to tell that the soldiers had been the peasants before. Now, they were equipped with leather armors, spears, and shields. They did not actually look all that different from the peasants wielding long scythes. The other knights only glanced at them in slight surprise before getting off of their horses to rest. They didn't seem to think any of it was out of place. The baron assigned to the Naran desert would never have only brought 30 lowly peasants with him. Providing the peasants some weapons and armor to be able to even somewhat fight seemed a normal thing to do. The knights secretly despised him. In the forces of the dukedom, the Swadian recruits would have been little more than conscripted cannon fodders. Let's head back to camp. Kant hardly paid any attention to the sarcastic looks in the eyes of the knights and simply continued to give orders. The sun was scorching as they stood on the dunes. All of them felt rather dizzy and short of breath after that intense battle. If they delayed resting any further, they would all soon be battling heatstroke. Even the war horses began to have foam in their noses and mouths as they restlessly sighed. "Pack up and give the horses some water," Rowan said to his subordinate knights. To the knights, their war horses were their companions. Everyone headed to the makeshift camp below the dunes. They urgently needed a good rest after the battle. The knight at the very rear, who was still holding on to his warhorse at the top of the dunes, pointed to the north and shouted in surprise, "Lord Edmund, the god of war, look, isn't that the Oasis lookout?" "What?" Everyone looked up with a surprised expression. All their gazes were on the shouting knight, who seemed to have turned into a statue at the top of the dunes. Kant gulped. He was one of the first to regain his composure. He quickly climbed up the dunes and traced where the knight pointed. At the end of the horizon, a patch of green could vaguely be seen among all the yellow. It was a clear sign. If there was green in the desert, that said green could only be an oasis. "We're here." Kant was unable to help but mutter to himself. He clenched his teeth and uttered, "The Oasis lookout." Everyone climbed to the top of the dunes and gazed at the green far away. All of them were stunned, yet it was excitement like no other seen in their eyes. They had toiled for 6 days on their journey and finally reached their destination. The southern side of the Naran desert was the fief and estate belonging to Baron Kant, the Oasis lookout. Hooray! The knights excitedly cheered. The discovery meant that they would finally be able to go home. They no longer needed to slow down to wait for the carriages and peasants. They could ride home as quickly as possible. It would only take them 3 days to get to the territory of the Dukedom of Leo and the comfortable lives they had once taken for granted. All right, all right." Kant's voice pulled all those people back from their excitement. He rested his light crossbow on his shoulders and looked at the dukedom knights. He said, "We should probably settle down in the tents and have a good lunch at such a moment." "You're right, your lordship." Rowan smiled and nodded. The other knights agreed and took their horses slowly down the dunes. The Oasis lookout was not far away, so everyone was in a good mood. The only exception was Kant. Chapter 4, Psychological Warfare. The knights, who were drenched in sweat from the recent fighting, slowly walked down the dunes. The Swadian peasants and recruits headed for the temporary camp set up below. There was still lunch waiting to be made and complicated labor that needed to be finished. Kant continued to stand on the dunes under the scorching sun. He gazed at the Oasis lookout on the horizon, which was his supposed fief. There was a fresh water spring in it. "I think this is going to be troublesome." Kant heavily sighed. His eyes looked worried. He scanned his surroundings and the lowly dead beings below. Their bodies were left strewn about. He felt pressure deep down instead of relief. Jackalans had been found somewhere close to the Oasis lookout. The implications of that were undeniably severe. Kant was unable to help but wear a bitter smirk. Just think about it a little, man. There is no way the Oasis lookout could always stay deserted. The purge carried out by the Dukedom of Leo 10 years ago had only been temporary. The Jackalans had returned and retaken the Oasis. He made some calculations based on the 50 Jackalans that had just been slain. He concluded that there were likely no less than 300 in the tribe of Jackalans that had taken over the Oasis lookout. The numbers could even be higher if the entire tribe was accounted for. What do I do now? At that thought, Kant felt a headache forming. Ding. Side quest assigned. Side quest: annihilate the Jackalan tribe. Reward: Desert Bandit Lair X1. Introduction: the Oasis lookout is the pearl of the south of the desert, yet it is now being taken over by a tribe of Jackalans. The ferocious race of beings has sullied the beauty of the Oasis. As the lord of the Naran desert from here on out, it is imperative that you annihilate them. A system prompt appeared just when he was wondering what to do from then on out. The system's dialog box was displayed on his retina, showing the side quest assigned by the system. Annihilate the Jackalan tribe? Kant repeated the mission perimeters. The bitter smirk remained on his face. Even without the system quest assigned, he would have had to annihilate the tribe that had taken over the Oasis lookout all the same. The Oasis lookout was the only oasis that had been found in the south of the Naran desert. More importantly, it was the only location with a water source. If he were unable to take the area for himself, Kant would be setting himself up to fail. According to their current storage of fresh water, which had begun to dip below the red line, even returning alive to the Dukedom of Leo would be a problem. In truth, even if he were able to return, as the youngest son of the Duke with an awkward status, there was no guarantee that Kant would be able to live without troubles. There were many people who did not wish to see him return. To them, it was best if he just simply died in the desert. Kant unconsciously clenched his teeth and walked down the dunes without saying a word. A Jackalan tribe with a population of at least 300 posed a serious threat to them. If they made one mistake, it could easily cause all of them to perish. The annihilation of 50 Jackalans in the previous battle had only happened because the system reminded Kant of the danger. He used their ambush against them and caught them completely off guard. Furthermore, the 20 of the Dukedom Knights, who had taken the Jackalans out, were elites. If they gave their all and earnestly fought, they would still suffer massive casualties as they tried to take out a tribe of 300 Jackalans. We could still try. Kant looked at the shadows moving about in the tents. His gaze unavoidably narrowed. In truth, if he were to conquer the Oasis lookout, the outcome would have little to do with the rookie Swadian recruits who had leveled up moments ago. The key still lied with the 20 Dukedom Knights. I know you people will definitely not agree with this, but I'm sorry. I've got no other choice. Kant's expression was calm. He had his own hidden plans. The knights were loyal to Cameron, the Duke of Leo. They only respected Kant due to his bloodline. When it came to actual command in combat, they were still the ones calling the shots. Kant understood that since he was unable to command the knights to fight for him, he would have to make them do so by putting the pressure of reality on them. They were in the Naran desert. There was only one thing that could move them. Water. It was something that they would have to fight over whether they liked it or not. Don't blame me for this. Kant was calm, yet a shimmer of coldness was seen deep in his eyes. After all, there was no such thing as trust between people. Kant was initially walking toward the tents, but he turned around and headed for the carriages. All the Swadian peasants were busy working. The Dukedom Knights were in their tents laughing heartily as if they were joking about something. No one paid him any attention. At the very least, no outsiders noticed him. My lord. 2 Swadian peasants had been tasked with guarding the goods on the carriages. Be quiet. Kant raised his hand and signaled for them to stop talking. He immediately unplugged the plugs at the bottom of the water storage barrels on the carriage. Glug, glug, glug. The crystal clear fresh water spilled onto the sand through the small openings. It took mere minutes for the barrels to store water on the carriage to be left with just a fraction of what they had once contained. The barren sand around them became drenched. Our water is about to get depleted. Kant looked at the two baffled Swadian peasants and reasserted himself. Understand? Yes, my lord, they answered. Good. There was not a single bit of expression seen on Kant's face as he walked to his tent as if nothing had happened. Only the peasants and recruits had been close to the carriage. None of the knights had bothered to go anywhere near since they had no reason to. None of the knights would have expected that not a single drop of water was left, especially since the amount of water in the barrels should have lasted 3 days. The lack of water would kill them. If they wanted to live, they would have to fight the Jackalans. This was how Kant planned to trick and force the dukedom knights to listen to his plans and fight the Jackalans to the bitter end. A man had to do what he had to do. After he came to this backward and mysterious world, Kant, as the youngest son of the Duke, learned how to make use of others to the greatest extent. All of that was completely normal considering how he was a noble. If Kant did not make use of the knights, he knew they would not stay back and fight just because of his status. No one would have toiled and put their lives on the line for others without anything to gain, especially given how he was an exiled baron. My lord. When Kant was still steeped in thought, a peasant in charge of cooking, who was holding a wooden plate, lifted the blinds on the tent and said, "Lunch is ready." "All right." Kant nodded and took a look. There were 3 pieces of white bread, half a smoked chicken, and 3 spoonfuls of juicy dried meat cooked in black pepper. That was the kind of gourmet meal that only his status as a baron could have afforded. White bread and black pepper were both luxuries. Squires and knights notwithstanding, even lesser nobles with comparatively small fiefs and less wealth in the dukedom were unable to afford such spices and high-quality, soft white bread. They could have only afforded black bread with wheat bran mixed within the flour, as well as simple cooked dried meat. Dried meat cooked in black pepper, et. Kant took the plate and said, "If I'm not mistaken, our supply of fresh water is running out." "Indeed, but we're not far away from the Oasis lookout, and there will be ample fresh water to be had," the peasant replied. "Is that so?" Kant nodded and told the peasant, "Tell Captain Rowan to come to my tent after he is done with lunch." "Yes, my lord," the peasant respectfully said before leaving the tent. Kant heartily ate his lunch with a wooden spoon. The white bread was soft and tasty, as well as of high quality. It had been prepared for him with butter before he left the castle in the dukedom of Leo. The same went for black pepper. Kant was a noble. Even if he had been exiled, he still represented the bloodline and glory of Duke Cameron. He was a baron and needed to be treated as one. At the very least, Kant no longer had to worry about food being nasty. Compared to the knights and peasants, he was actually having quite a good meal. "Too bad that I won't be able to eat like this any longer." He dipped the bread into the last bit of soup and put it in his mouth before chewing and gulping the last piece down. He spent 10 minutes eating lunch, no more and no less. He soon heard footsteps outside his tent. The leather boots stepped onto the slightly hard sand, making a cracking sound and leaving a footprint behind. It seemed that Rowan was outside. "Your lordship, I heard that you were looking for me." Captain Rowan could be heard from outside the tent. He sounded respectful and somewhat impatient at the same time. "Please come in." Kant's voice was calm as if he did not notice any of that. The blinds on the tent were lifted. Rowan stooped down for a bit before entering. He smiled faintly as he looked at Kant. "Your lordship, will soon be at the Oasis lookout. How can I be of service?" Without waiting for Kant to reply, he quickly added, "If there is nothing else, we will be leaving soon." "Leave?" Kant looked doubtful as he looked at Rowan and asked, "Shouldn't we be heading to the Oasis lookout?" Their destination was within sight, which made Rowan impatient. He had no intention of continuing the journey through the dreaded desert any longer. He was also impatient from being at the side of the exiled baron. Furthermore, as a veteran who had seen a lot of fighting, there was no way Rowan, the captain of the knights, was not able to see what the baron was up to. "Your lordship, the knights can't wait any longer." He took a good look at Kant. In a flat tone, he said, I'll make a request on their behalf. If possible, we'd like to have part of the drinking water supply. We shall begin our journey home right away. That was a firm, unyielding demand, not a request with room for negotiation. It was close to being rude. It meant that Rowan and the knights were on the brink of losing control. Of course, if that is what you desire. Rowan was surprised that Kent was so quick about it. The Baron nodded and thanked the captain, saying, It is thanks to the protection of your knights that we were able to make the journey. You have my gratitude. This is just part of our job. Rowan smiled and nodded. What Kent said next changed Rowan's expression drastically. Unfortunately, we're running low of water now. Chapter 5, The gamble was about to begin. The corner of Kent's mouth rose ever so slightly into a smirk. He looked at Rowan, who appeared to be baffled. He was laughing at Rowan. However, his expression remained calm. His furrowed brow revealed the anxiety he was feeling deep down. Actually, we don't have much water left after coming this far. How much do we have left? Rowan's face became glum. Not enough, Kent replied. The temperature outside had shot up to 158 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the air inside the tent remained rather cool. Both men silently sat across from each other without any other topic to continue the conversation. Rowan's face was sullen. It was as if he was the manifestation of dark clouds in the night, about to bring a storm. He knew what it meant to not have enough water at such a time. It was more about thirst, but it also meant that they would soon have to fight with all they had. His senses were perceptive enough to know this after having spent so much time on battlefields. There were more than 50 Jackalans found at the dunes, which were close to the Oasis lookout. That meant the Oasis lookout had long been taken over by the Jackalans. That's how it is. Rowan eventually nodded and looked at Kent with a sour expression. Bad news indeed, your lordship. Yes, bad news indeed. Kent nodded. The air remained cool as Rowan clenched his fists and gritted his teeth. But, your lordship, aren't you afraid? Afraid? Afraid of what? Kent asked as if he didn't understand. Why should I be afraid? Ha! Rowan chuckled for a bit at the infuriating irony of it all. He was filled with frustration. It steadily built up in his chest and seemed like it was about to turn into flames of rage. There was no way he was oblivious to what was happening. However, he dared not, and could not, do anything else. Kent was an exiled baron, albeit the least favorite youngest son of the Duke. Regardless of if Rowan thought the man was better off dead, a proper excuse was needed for the Baron to end up dead. For example, it would have been completely fine to have Kent taken out by the Jackalans on his way to his own fief. However, there was no way he could die by the hands of a knight of the Dukedom of Leo, especially one with no special status. Kent was part of Duke Cameron's bloodline, as well as a baron representing the Dukedom of Leo. Kent had won the round. Unfortunately, that was how the rules of the world worked. We could head to the Oasis lookout. Kent continued as if there was nothing out of the ordinary. According to the records, there is spring water there. Kent paused and looked at Rowan before continuing. Fresh, sweet, high-quality spring water that is so good it could be used for brewing wine. That is good to hear. From Rowan's perspective, all of that sounded pointless. Rowan had no intention of humoring the Baron any further. With a gloomy look on his face, he asked, Your lordship, what should we do from here on out? Head to the Oasis lookout, Kent replied with a smile. But the Oasis lookout has been taken over by a bunch of Jackalans. We have absolutely no chance of taking out those beasts with the kind of numbers we have on our side. Rowan had grown impatient and laid the truth out. Kent acted surprised. What? Your lordship, we both understand what is going on here. Neither of us is a bloody fool. Rowan took a deep breath and said, We need to take out the Jackalan tribe at the Oasis lookout one way or another. Otherwise, we will all end up dying of thirst in the Naran desert. None of us will be able to survive. This is serious. Kant lowered his head as if he had not been getting what Rowan was saying. Rowan ignored the movement and continued speaking. My subordinates all have their own families. They have their beloved and their children. None of them want to stay here forever. That would be unfair to them. He took a good look at Kant and said with a severe tone, Your Lordship, I hope you can understand. The Jackalans have taken the spring water of the Oasis lookout for themselves. Kant seemed to nod with the same exasperation and said, We will take out those Jackalans. Afterward, you all will be free to go home. Any plans then? Rowan asked while gritting his teeth. Given how things turned out, there was no way he believed that Kant had no other plans in mind. Besides, it was this young baron who had caused all of this in the first place. Kant, of course, had further plans to deal with the situation. Struggling to hold back all his anger as he looked at Rowan, Kant said, We will ambush the Jackalans while they are unaware of what is going on. The Jackalan tribe doesn't know that we're here. So, we will lay in the dark. After all, we're the ones with the element of surprise. Ambush. Rowan's voice slightly raised as he said, The knights will suffer heavy casualties. Rowan took a deep breath before saying, Please note that we only have 20 knights at our disposal, Your Lordship. My people will be a part of this, Kant said with a calm expression. If our ambush is a success, the Jackalans will be thrown into chaos. We'll take them all out before they can regroup and organize an effective retaliation. Do you mean those peasants of yours, Your Lordship? Rowan's face was filled with unconcealed sarcasm and ridicule. I have to admit, they are good at working in the fields. They can fight as well, Kant replied. Your Lordship, you're playing with fire here. Rowan glared at Kant with anger in his eyes. That is being irresponsible to my subordinates. Kant looked at the man in the eye calmly and replied, It's either that, or we all die of thirst in the desert. This is a gamble with our lives on the line. Rowan's voice was somewhat raised. That is how war works, Kant replied without shirking away. He remained looking at the middle-aged man while he rummaged through his pocket for a purse. Will this be enough? The purse was woven with sturdy linen threads. Clanging metals could be heard as Kant threw the purse. Well, Rowan caught it and felt the obvious weight of the metals in his hand. Kant said, This is a reward for the hard work of you and your men. It is 20 great silvers. 20 great silvers. Rowan's breath became somewhat rushed since that was not a small number. Their monthly pay was only 20 small silvers each. The exchange rate between the two types of silver currencies was 100 small silvers for 1 great silvers. That money meant that every one of the knights would receive 5 months' worth of extra pay. I know you all could leave after escorting us to the Oasis lookout, so this would be my pay for hiring you. Kant looked at Rowan and solemnly said, You should be able to understand that if our ambush is a success, we may all come out alive. The term ambush meant a surprise attack out of nowhere. It was as simple and straightforward as it could have been. One could have called it sneaking up on one's enemy as well. It was a tactic to deal an effective blow on one's enemy when one's forces were vastly outnumbered by said enemy. The effect of an ambush was even more apparent when cavalry units were concerned since they had the advantage of high mobility. The effects of employing such a tactic would have been like no other. That was why Kant went all the way to pull what he pulled. It was to force Rowan and the knights to stay behind. An ambush from only 10 Swadian recruits and 20 Swadian peasants would have been pathetic. When will we be doing this? Rowan's expression softened after taking the great silvers. He looked at Kant and said, We need to wait for the right time when the Jackalans are the most relaxed. Perhaps dawn would be a good choice for doing so. No, Kant immediately shot down the suggestion. While the Jackalans were at their most relaxed moments before dawn, Kant's entourage did not have too much time to wait. Why? Rowan frowned. He was very confident about his experience on the battlefield. Kant explained, the slaughtered Jackalans at the side of the dunes will have alerted those at the Oasis lookout. If none of them return during sunset, the Jackalan tribe will be able to guess that there are enemies nearby. Rowan's breathing became ragged as he asked, "When should we do it?" "Sundown." After thinking for a while, Kant seriously said, "We shall launch the ambush when the sun is about to set." "The evening glow," Rowan added. "That's right. The sun will be our ally. The light shall conceal our presence." Kant took a deep breath and said, "There is no way they can detect us quickly enough. At that time, all your people need to do is charge as quickly as you can, throwing the entire tribe of Jackalans into chaos." Kant paused for a bit and slowly added, "After that, my men and I will charge as well." It was silent in the tent. It took quite a while before Rowan looked up and said, "All right. We won't fail," Kant said, smiling as he looked at Rowan. "Trust me. The battle today will be one of your proudest stories when your people are out having a good time drinking in the tavern." Rowan chuckled and glanced at Kant. "I sure hope so." He walked outside the tent and said to Kant, "We'll get prepared." "Sure." Kant nodded. He was all alone in the tent again, but his expression had become incredibly severe. A brutal battle was about to begin. There were probably some among the knights escorting them that would end up dead. As for Kant's current Swadian members, who were in charge of the construction of his estate from then on out, some would be lost as well. You can't go through life without making huge gambles once or twice. Kant took a deep breath. He chose to come to the Oasis lookout. That in itself was tantamount to gambling on its own. He had next to nothing, yet he wanted to live. The only way to secure a good life was to give it his all. Kant touched the light crossbow by his side and chuckled in a self-deprecating manner. "Well, it's not like we're going to lose for sure." He had come all this way to win. It was a victory he had to secure at all costs. Chapter 6, The Color of Blood Under the Evening Sun. It was 5 p.m. Sundown was near. The setting sun went below the dunes. As it shone, the light made the sand look like gold. Kant stood at the top of the dunes. From behind, the sun's brilliant beams looked as if they were about to engulf his entire being. The Oasis lookout was less than a mile away from where he stood. He was able to see something in the sand before him. It brilliantly glittered in the dusk's light. It was the Oasis lookout's water source, which was a lake formed by a geyser. Judging from the area alone, it was approximately 82 feet by 19 feet. Considering the minimal mass, it was more accurate to call it a pond. Kant couldn't help but say, "This is beautiful." Several lush shrubs surrounded the pond, as well as 6 huge desert poplar trees. Those green plants proudly stretched out their branches and leaves in the evening sun. It was as if they were indicating that regardless of how unforgiving the sand was, they remained steadfast in their resistance. Rowan, the captain of the knights, stood by his side and nodded with a cold expression. "Yes, beautiful, indeed." Kant calmly said, "All the more reason not to let the Jackalans take the place." "Of course." Rowan coldly nodded. He scanned the Oasis lookout and discovered that tents had been erected around the pond. The tents looked ragged and cobbled up from all manners of materials, including linen, tree bark, and pelts from hunted beasts. The whole setup looked completely different from the tents that Kant's men and the knights had erected not long ago. Regardless of the state they were in, the tents indicated where the Jackalan tribe was. Rowan took a deep breath and asked in a severe tone, "Your lordship, when should we begin?" "There's no need to rush." Kant turned around and looked at the sun, which was still mustering the last bit of its power before setting. The beams of the setting sun shone past the two men and engulfed the Oasis lookout below. The beams shone onto the Jackalan tribes as well. If someone below were to look out, the sun would have looked to be at the same line as the dunes, which would have appeared very blinding. Kant nodded and said, "Now." "Very well." Rowan nodded coldly and took the lance in his hand. He quickly retreated down the dunes. At the bottom of the dunes, 20 well-armed dukedom of Leo knights were leading their horses and standing by. They were prepared to fight. The only thing that was needed now was an order from Rowan. They were about to begin a battle from which they could not afford to back down. All of them sported cold expressions. Deep in their eyes, anger and hatred were visible. All of them understood what had caused all of this. It was Kant. He was a baron of the dukedom of Leo. They escorted the noble to the Naran desert so he could claim his fief. They had been traveling for 6 days, yet they were told at noon that there was no water left for their return trip. They were then told to fight for their lives. As such, they were angry and resentful. Edmund, the great god of war, is watching us. Rowan took the reins of his warhorse and made his way in front of his men. With a severe expression, he said, "We shall let these lowly, filthy Jackalans, who know nothing but eating sand in the desert, know the bravery of the dukedom of Leo." The knights unanimously responded, "Victory!" The dukedom of Leo was established through martial prowess. The faith of the nation surrounded Edmund, the god of war, who, per his namesake, was a god presiding over war. As such, none of them were afraid. All of them turned the anger in their minds into strength. It's beginning. Kant saw the 20 knights get onto their horses, scale the dunes, and charge straight down to the Oasis lookout. The hard horseshoes pounded heavily on the sands, kicking up a lot of dust and sand, which swooped about like a gale. The lances were thrust forward without mercy before the Jackalans at the Oasis lookout knew what was going on. The tips of the lances pierced one baffled Jackalan after another. Blood was spilled, yet none of the 20 dukedom knights had any intentions of putting down their lances. They gritted their teeth as they held their lances up, continuing to skewer the Jackalans like kebabs as they charged deeper into the tribe. They knew what they had to do. They had to cause chaos of great magnitude. "Our turn now!" Kant shouted excitedly and raised the light crossbow in his hand. He headed out with great strides. The 10 Swadian recruits held spears and followed right behind him. The 20 Swadian peasants followed at the flank with their long scythes in hand. They were moving fairly quickly. It was almost as if they were sprinting. The murderous intent in their eyes was unmistakable. They were all determined to take the Oasis lookout, which would be their lord's fief and their home from then on out. For the dukedom of Leo. Rowan and the 20 knights gritted their teeth as they charged deeper into the tribe. By then, their lances were broken, but they quickly switched to the long swords at their sides and swung hard at the Jackalans, which seemed to have emerged out of nowhere. The ambush was surprisingly successful. The Jackalans had no idea whatsoever that they would soon be attacked. The chaos quickly spread to the outer fringes of the Jackalan tribe's camp. With their green eyes open wide, most of the Jackalans simply stood there, staring in confusion. It would have been difficult for them to even get a good look at the invading enemy. Whenever they heard shrieks from the west, they turned around and quickly found the evening sun above them shining straight into their eyes. It prevented them from opening their eyes. Gallop, 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 gallop. The galloping noises of the horses grew increasingly closer. When the Jackalans finally saw their enemy, they found one human knight after another looming over them. By then, it was too late. Rowan led his knights, who were swinging their swords, into the Jackalans. Blood was seen splattering everywhere. The Jackalans, who had long, pointy tusks and were covered in grey fur, finally began to crumble. Fear was seen all over their wolf-like faces. "Maintain formation. Come with me." Swooping noises were heard from Kant's light crossbow. A nearby Jackalan was seen tumbling to the ground. The bolt in its back pierced through its spine, stabbing into its heart. Kant hardly cared. His face remained cold as he deeply set his gaze onto the Jackalan tribe. Rowan and 19 knights of the dukedom were still swinging their swords in a frenzy. They continued to cause panic among the Jackalans and spread the stench of blood and death. "Keep charging." Kant drew his short sword and led the charge forward with 30 men behind him. The Jackalan tribe, which by then was thrown into complete chaos, was utterly unable to retaliate effectively. That enabled Kent and his men to move even quicker. Shrieks from countless downed Jackalans were heard everywhere. The Jackalans scattered all over the place. The old, the young, and those in their prime were all running and cowering in fear. They were up against knights that had appeared out of nowhere. They also faced Swadian recruits holding spears. The Jackalans' minds were quickly flooded with all those memories from 10 years ago. That had been a complete slaughter carried out by the Dukedom of Leo. Those memories were horrifying night terrors that continued to haunt the Jackalans until the present day. The memories were so horrifying that, even at present, the Jackalans who had survived the slaughter dared not continue to resist. Leave none of them alive. We do not need prisoners. Kant's voice was heard throughout the Oasis lookout, which, at the same time, sealed the horrible fates of the Jackalans. The knights continued to pursue the Jackalans who had scattered and escaped. The Swadian peasants and Swadian recruits circled the Oasis lookout's pond and began cleaning up any Jackalans found within the tents of the tribe. Since they had won, they were relegated to cleaning up the battlefield. The Jackalans, who had all lost the will to resist, became sheep awaiting slaughter. Furthermore, those ferocious primitive beings were unable to compete with humans when it came to war, be it in terms of tactics or weapons and equipment. The evening sun finally set beyond the dunes. The fighting was over. The remaining glow of the sun struggled to light the darkened sky, giving off final bits of light before eventually setting. Before long, the moon was vaguely seen rising into the sky. A night sky filled with stars quickly took over. The high temperatures of the day seemed to have instantly subsided. The strong wind blowing from the depths of the desert brought with it a chilling cold. A few hours later, the temperature in the Naran desert dipped to a freezing -4 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, such bone-chilling cold had yet to hit them. The knights, who had been killing all over the place just a short while ago, gathered around on their horses. The cooling winds felt very comfortable. "Your lordship, your fief is now finally yours." Rowan, the captain of the knights, got off his horse. His expression remained cold. The linen robes, which Rowan and the knights behind him wore over their mail armor, were all stained with huge patches of blood. It was as if their garb had been dyed. They looked very out of place. 4 or 5 unlucky ones ended up injured. Either their arms were hanging limply, or they were walking with a limp. It was obvious that the battle had not been an easy one. Some Jackalans burst forth under the threat of death, yet they still managed to deal light damage to the knights at the front. "You should probably wash your wounds." Kant looked at the injured ones and nodded to Rowan, saying, "If you don't mind, I can bandage your men's wounds. I learned first aid knowledge on the battlefield from veterans quite a while ago." "That won't be necessary." Rowan immediately declined. They were military veterans. Dressing and bandaging wounds were things that their men could easily do. Captain Rowan coldly said to Kant, "We will leave at once, right now." The knights behind him all looked at Kant coldly. Even if he were to lower his status, none of the knights would behave or look any friendlier toward him. Everyone knew who had started all the fighting. "Are you leaving now?" Kant frowned slightly and said in an exasperated manner, "This is rather unexpected. Perhaps you all should stay and rest for a couple of days." Furthermore, the Naran desert at night was not a good time to do such a thing. Without ample heat retention equipment, temperatures of -4 degrees Fahrenheit were easily life-threatening. "We don't need rest. We will leave immediately after replenishing our stores of fresh water." As he spoke, Rowan wiped the blood off of his face. His tone confirmed that he would not be negotiating. He was simply making a firm statement. He turned around to face the knights and yelled, "What are you people still standing there for? Get the water sacks and clothes from the carriages. Get ready to go home after you get the water filled. Hurry up." "Yes, sir," the knights responded and left to immediately get their tasks completed. Their assignments were clear. They quickly took their tents and wool clothing for warmth from the carriages. At the same time, each of them carried 5 extra water sacks. They filled the sacks at the pond. "All right, I wish you all a quick and safe journey home. Enjoy your lagers at the tavern when you return." Kant shrugged exasperatedly and continued, "By then, I figure you people will be bragging about your time with me as you talk about the battle today." Rowan narrowed his gaze while the knights behind him all looked cold and uncaring. None of them cared about the cold joke that Kant had just uttered. They were busy with their own tasks. When everything was done, they mounted their horses and left without the slightest intention of even saying farewell to Kant. In their eyes, Kant was little more than a stranger to them. "Farewell." Kant waved them goodbye, nonetheless, looking calm as he did so. As a noble and a revered baron, he had long learned how to be shameless when the time called for it. That was how nobles survived around each other. Chapter 7, Founding of Drondheim. Kant understood what the knights were feeling all too well. As such, he was not angered at all by how they simply left without so much as saying proper goodbyes. Things were totally opposite of what they had expected. The knights, who had just fought a bloody battle, derived no joy from the victory they secured. Be it Captain Rowan or his 19 subordinate knights, all of them were resentful of Kant. It was so much so that it seemed like all that resentment was pent up like a volcano in their chests. It seemingly would have erupted for all to see within moments. The Jackalans had been losers, but the knights were not winners either. Kant was the only winner. The Baron, who had finally claimed ownership of the Oasis lookout, was the only true winner. "Goodbye." Kant watched them as they disappeared beyond the dunes. With their spears on their shoulders, the Swadian recruits tasked with guard duty reported, "My lord, they have all left." "Yeah, they are quite fast." Kant nodded. Since they were knights, one of the troop classes known for their high mobility, that was entirely normal. Without the carriages and infantry units getting in the way, they had no problem marching several times faster than they had on the journey there. It was likely they would be able to scale over the Seenway Ridge and return to their comfortable homes in the Dukedom of Leo in less than 3 days. It's for the best that they left. Kant let out a sigh of relief. At the very least, the Oasis lookout was finally in his control. If the Dukedom Knights, who were natives of that world, had stayed back at the Oasis, it would have caused him a lot of trouble. He needed to rely on the system to carry out the subsequent construction of his fief. At that point, he would have had to make an excuse to get them to leave. Suddenly, the system prompt appeared on his retina. Ding! After fighting a hard battle, the enemy is finally crushed. Side quest, annihilate the Jackalan tribe is complete. Reward acquired, Desert Bandit Lair X1. Comment, a brilliant strategy and astonishing tactics were used. The victory of that exhilarating battle is indeed praiseworthy. The dialogue box signaling the completion of the side quest appeared on his retina. However, that was not the only dialogue box. Ding! Your forces have upgradable units. Kant's personal forces had also been hard at work during the extermination of the Jackalan tribe. Furthermore, their labor had been very fruitful. When things went south and all of the Jackalans lost their will to fight, they scattered and ran all over the place without any idea where they were running. A good number of them were quickly dealt with on the spot by Swadian troops, who charged at them with spears and long scythes. As such, all of his troops gained a lot of experience. For troop classes in the early stages, all of that had been enough to give them an upgrade. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Peasants X20. Spend 10 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Recruit. Kant was surprised by the upgrade option. The remaining 20 Swadian peasants were available to level up. What surprised Kant, even more, was that the Swadian recruits, who had not been leveled up for long, were able to continue leveling up. Upgradable troop class, Swadian Recruits X10. Spend 20 dinars each to upgrade to Swadian Militia. The recruits, who were equipped with spears and wearing leather armor, had been the main infantry force for Kant in the previous battle. Armed with pointy spears, they killed a good number of Jackalans that dared to get near them. It could have been said that compared to the peasants, those Swadian recruits were the only ones capable of serving as the most basic form of combatant forces. Well, the cost in dinars is rather steep this time. Kant frowned. Upgrading 20 Swadian peasants to become Swadian recruits would cost him 200 dinars. Upgrading 10 Swadian recruits to become Swadian militia would also cost him 200 dinars. Dinar was the name of a currency. However, it was only a currency that existed within the system, so only Kant was able to acquire and use it. What made Kant rather restless was that upgrading both classes would cost him 400 dinars, which would empty his savings. He had been taking on many side quests in secret since he came to that world, yet he had only been able to earn 500 dinars. He had spent 100 dinars in the previous upgrade. With the Swadian recruits now waiting to be upgraded, the cost meant saying farewell to all of his savings. It doesn't seem like I have a choice, do I? Kant lightly sighed. He shook his head and wore a bitter smirk, but he still said, "System, upgrade them all." Things were not quite in his favor. Those dinars were not an expenditure he could afford to hold on to. Kant had been living two lives. He was equipped with all the experience gained from his past and current lives, so he knew how to go about the current situation well. When he came to the Naran desert and chose to stay at the Oasis lookout, which was in the middle of nowhere and outside of the dukedom of Leo proper, it could have been said that he lost everything he had in the past, which included aid from the dukedom of Leo. His greatest backing at the moment was himself, which included the Swadian troops that originated from the system. Mystical system data descended from the sky. The 20 Swadian peasants were enveloped in data chains and became more buff. Spears, leather armors, leather hats, and hand axes to be placed at their sides and on their shields and backs were all provided. As for the 10 Swadian recruits, the upgrade to become Swadian militia was even more noteworthy. Their bodies became even hardier, and their spears became heavier due to the front ends being covered in metal. The armor beneath their linen robes became scale armor, which had better defensive stats. They were also given combat shovels, which were effective for piercing armor, as well as thicker and sturdier shields. Appearance-wise, they had completely cast off the peasant look. Despite being called Swadian militia, they actually looked and felt like regular army units. From Kant's perspective, this militia was fully qualified to participate in wars, even back in the dukedom of Leo. "Greetings, Lord Kant." The 20 Swadian recruits and 10 Swadian militia lined up in a formation. They stood tall and proud as if they were in a parade. Kant smiled and said, "Splendid." With 30 infantry units serving him, he was finally able to claim the Oasis lookout without worries. Even if the scattered Jackalans, who had managed to make it back into the desert, were to organize a retaliation, Kant was more than ready to take them on. He would be able to keep the Oasis and develop it into a better place. Desert flowers needed to be watered with blood. Kant took a breath. The thick stench of blood still lingered around his nose. He looked up at the sky. The last bits of rays from the sun were no more. The moon was high up in the sky. Moonlight mixed with the dazzling stars in the clear sky, shining down on the silent night. Still, the bodies of Jackalans were littered all over the Oasis lookout. The thick stench of blood permeated the area, ruining the scene and mood altogether. "Let's clean up the battlefield." Kant waved and gave his troops an order. "Gather the bodies of the Jackalans and burn them." "Understood." The troops responded and headed out. The act of burning the Jackalan bodies was to prevent them from contaminating the water source when they rotted. They were in the desert, so water resources in the Oasis were precious tactical supplies. If germs from the rotting, dirty bodies were to seep into water sources beneath the sand, regret would do them no good. That was something noteworthy. The troops knew that as well, so they began picking up the bodies of dead Jackalans. They gathered them into a huge pile below the dunes hundreds of feet away. Kant, on the other hand, closed his eyes and communicated with the system in his mind. He had finally been able to get a main quest, which he had been delaying for 16 years. Now that Kant had taken over the Oasis lookout, he could construct a village with the help of the system. It allowed him to build his forces and eventually control the entire Naran desert. It also meant that he might be able to eventually extend his hands back into the dukedom of Leo. System, can I build a village? Kant silently asked his question. The system immediately replied, you may. A dialog box appeared. Ding, you have discovered this region after a careful search. Main quest, build a village is complete. Reward, 1000 dinars. Introduction, this is an oasis in the barren desert. You need to consider how to develop your village. The dialog box disappeared. Data from the system began to coalesce before Kant's eyes. A two-story building constructed from stone and wood finally materialized into the world. It was a Kingdom of Swadia conventional building from the system. At the same time, a new dialog box appeared. Ding, your village has been constructed. Please name your village. Remark, the Lord's page will open after naming your village. Name the village? Kant was momentarily stunned. He looked at the building before him and said, Drondheim. That was the most famous city in the Kingdom of Swadia, which was located at the center of the continent of Karadia. It was a well-known place lauded to be the city with the strongest defense in all of the Kingdom of Swadia. Ding, name of village, Drondheim. The village had officially been named. As Kant confirmed it, the page of Drandheim appeared on his retina. Drandheim. Lord, Kant. Type, Swadian village. Population, 50. Building, Council Hall. Constructions available, house, city wall, mill, watchtower, well. Current forces, Swadian recruits, 20, Swadian militia, 10. Recruitable, Swadian recruit. Comment, the obscure village of Drondheim, located in a small oasis, has a worrisome future. After that, the flow of data before Kant completely disappeared. The village, which he named Drondheim, finally appeared before him. To say that it was a village would have been an exaggeration. At the moment, Drondheim's only standing building was the council hall, which served as the center of the village. It was usually where village elders took up residence. In the system, that was the background building where players often met quest-giving NPCs. However, that place became a real building after he came to that world. My lord. Subservient voices were heard, which stunned Kant. A thick wooden door at the side of the stone building opened. One Swadian peasant wearing linen robes after another gushed out from within. They hung their heads low and pressed their chests, greeting Kant in respect. Right. Kant nodded. It was only then that he remembered that on the village page of Drondheim, it was stated that the population was 50. The 50 Swadian peasants stood neatly before him. There were no more and no less. Chapter 8, Troubles in the Morning. The peasants all stood up, seemingly in high spirits. Very well. Kant nodded, feeling satisfied. Those 50 Swadian peasants were the base population of Drondheim from then on out. They were now the main force driving the village's future development. This was not a game. While Kant only needed to fight battles with his newly created troops, he still needed a certain number of peasants to look after the village. They needed to make the village, which currently only had the council hall, bigger and stronger. The 50 Swadian peasants also solved the safety problem they currently faced. With the 20 dukedom of Leo knights gone, Kant and the Oasis lookout had faced a huge predicament. The escaped Jackalans would have no intention of simply let things slide. They would have regrouped and tried to take back the Oasis that had once been their home, militantly clashing with Kant. The Oasis lookout was still at the forefront of danger. The 10 Swadian militia and 20 Swadian recruits were too small of a force to deal with such a threat. The addition of the new peasants considerably relieved the lingering threat. At the very least, if they were to be put in a tight formation with their long scythes in hand, it would be impossible for the Jackalans, who did not even have iron weapons, to break through their defenses. We still need further development. Kant was planning in his mind. According to the systems page, the only building the village currently had was that simple, shabby council hall. As for the other buildings, such as houses, city walls, mills, watchtowers, and wells, all of those would require funds and time to construct. The process would be as complicated as constructing real buildings. There was nothing Kant could do about it. Funds and time were the two things he needed the most. The Jackalans were not going to give him time. Furthermore, the only funds available to him were the 1,000 dinars acquired for completing the main quest of building a village. There was one other thing that made Kant feel exasperated. That world had several currencies: small silver, great silver, and gold, which was of an even higher value. None of those currencies were exchangeable for the dinars required by the system. The burden is heavy, and the road is long, he thought. Kant could not help but shake his head with a bitter smile. The bright, beautiful moonlight enveloped the entire place. Without any means of temperature regulation, the chill throughout the desert quickly grew apparent. The night was no longer young. Yet, the Oasis lookout was still as busy as it was during the day. It was impossible for 80 people to just camp outside Indiana, a desert. The council hall was the only building in the village. Despite being 2 stories, it was not that big of a building. It was only of 5,380 square feet at most, which was equal to the size of a bungalow within the country. Fitting all 80 people inside was impossible. Kant quickly made arrangements. The 30 troops were assigned to rest within the council hall while the 50 peasants were told to set up camp outside around the council hall. Kant had brought a good number of living supplies in the 3 carriages. Those supplies included huge tents that could fit plenty of people, as well as wool clothing to keep everyone warm. All of that was enough for the 50 peasants to get through the night. Kant had his reasons for making such arrangements. Rather, he had his priorities. Regardless, the 10 Swadian militia and 20 Swadian recruits were all that formed his current main combat force. Losing even one of them would have created quite a heartache for him. They all had a lot to do with how his future forces would be developed, which meant that he could not afford to treat them as expendables. As for guard duty that night, it was also taken care of by his 30 troops. As such, they needed more rest to be able to deal with any potential crisis that might arise. The 50 peasants, who were all outside the council hall, had superior numbers. Even if there was any danger, they could quickly band together when prompted by the troops on duty, forming tight formations to protect themselves and prevent any huge casualties from happening. Reality was usually cruel. The so-called protection was, at times, little more than petty compassion and kindness. Kant was far from pedantic. He, on the other hand, knew the value of the concept of gaining the highest benefit with the lowest cost. All right, hurry up people. Kant hurried his people to get the tents set up as soon as possible to prevent any unforeseen circumstances from happening. Campfires were lit at the same time. They used tent materials and wood found in the Jackalan tribe to start them. The fires raged and burned brightly, giving off heat to somewhat ward off the chill of the night. The Oasis lookout camp was almost finished being set up. A peasant briskly walked up to Kant and said, "My lord, your room is ready." "I see." Kant nodded. His room was on the 2nd floor of the council hall, which was guarded by 10 Swadian militia. The 20 Swadian recruits were getting ready on the floor below to ensure that nothing untoward happened to him. They originated from the system, so they only existed because Kant existed. As such, he had nothing to worry about when it came to their loyalty. He looked at the dazzling stars in the sky. The chill around made him shudder. "Best be careful." He said that to the peasants as walked into the council hall. He walked up to the 2nd floor via the stairs at the corner of the hall. Kant's room was at the very end. The place had been tidied up by the militia. The room had a window, which coincidentally faced the pond. Kant gazed out the window. Light from the night sky shone soft light on the pond. It glittered as the water danced from the gently blowing wind. The beautiful scenery was mesmerizing. Kant was unable to help but say, "This is indeed beautiful." This was the first time he had witnessed such a beautiful sight since he entered the Naran desert. Unlike the harsh and burly desert, the beauty before him was soft and gentle. However, he quickly pulled his thoughts back and took a good look at his room. He knew that he would have to stay in that room for a very long time in the future. The room was approximately 107 square feet. It was furnished with a wooden bed and wardrobe, as well as a crudely made table and chair. All in all, the layout looked primitive and cramped. The accommodations were only slightly better than what commoners would have. The single bed had a linen sheet on top of it. There was also a blanket made of wool and cotton neatly folded at the end of the bed. Everything looked to be the standard style of the Kingdom of Swadia. While the room looked crude, it was well kept. At the very least, there was no odor around. "It looks decent." Kant felt satisfied with the room. Besides, the option to sleep on a wooden bed without worries in a protected room was far better than sleeping in a shallow hole that looked like a grave hastily dug in the desert. Despite being the youngest son of a duke, he had still experienced harshness in life. He placed the light crossbow and quiver neatly on the table. He took off the linen robe, which served to shield him against the dust, dusting it for a bit before hanging it on the wardrobe. However, Kant did not take his clothes off. He also kept his short sword at his side. Despite being in a room that was close to 10 Swadian militia, he deemed it best to be on guard. At the very least, if anything unforeseen were to happen, he would not be caught off guard and end up in a panic. Kant spread his blanket out and went to bed. He slept soundly, possibly due to having made a long, arduous journey, as well as having to fight a bloody battle on top of that. The crisp chirp of birds was heard, which woke him up. Chirp, chirp, chirp. Kant slightly opened his eyes, still drowsy from the restful sleep. 2 birds were standing at the window. He did not know what kind they were, but they resembled sparrows except were a dirt yellow color. They chirped as they hopped about, pecking at the ledge with their beaks. The light of the morning sun shone through the window. The sun had risen. Humph! Kant took off his blanket. The early morning in the Naran desert still felt somewhat cold. However, he knew it would not take long for the temperature to quickly skyrocket, reaching a level of heat that no man could withstand. He put on his linen robe and looked outside as he stood at the side of his bed. A sea of sand was spread out before him. The desert's yellow dirt seemed to be out to swallow everything. Only the small bit of green nearby gave him a measure of reassurance. This was how the Oasis lookout was. The crystal clear spring water reflected the bit of light. The shallow depth, which was not even a couple of feet, enabled him to easily see the sand and rocks beneath. Kant unconsciously said, "Beautiful indeed." He was correct. Compared to the Naran desert as a whole, the oasis was like a paradise. And, it was a paradise that belonged to him. He frowned and found that the paradise was still a dirty one. The Jackalan's messy tents lined the sides of the pond. There was garbage from living nearby for years, as well as excrement, scattered all over the place in messy piles. Those beings had no concept of hygiene. They were defiling the oasis. When he saw Swadian peasants already hard at work cleaning up the garbage, his mind was put at ease. That area was to soon become the place where they would settle down. The sight of messy garbage littering the place was an eyesore to the peasants, who were inherently people with an affinity for cleanliness and loved the sight of a beautiful field. They promptly went on to clean the place up because it was all too much for them to stomach. Knock, knock. There was knocking on the door. A voice from outside said, "My lord, breakfast is ready. Would you like some now?" It was the Swadian peasant from before. "I'll get it right away," Kant replied. He closed the window and walked out of his room. A stout peasant was respectfully waiting for him outside. Kant asked, "What's for breakfast?" "Bread slices and soup made of dried meat cooked with cabbage," the peasant replied. Dried meat cooked with cabbage. Kant was rather shocked. He walked down the stairs to the lower floor and said, "I don't remember bringing cabbage with us." He paused and seemed to have recalled something. "Does the council hall have cabbage?" "Yes, my lord." The peasant nodded and said, "There were 500 loaves of bread, 250 pieces of dried meat, and 100 cabbages in the storage room." "That many?" Kant frowned slightly. The bread, dried meat, and cabbage were all calculated in hundreds, so they were huge numbers. However, the man hesitated for a bit before adding, "All of that can only last for 10 days. Kant was baffled. 10 days? The man nodded and said, "Indeed, my lord. We need to search for more food, or we will run out of food in 10 days. Even if we conserve whatever food we have, we'll only be able to last about 15 days. They went outside the council hall. The greenery around the pond was still as lush as ever. However, Kant was no longer in the mood to admire it. He frowned and asked, "How could we eat that much?" The 50 Swadian peasants were tidying up the oasis. They were cleaning up the Jackalan tribe's toppled tents, as well as the garbage and excrement they left behind. The 10 Swadian militia were patrolling with their iron-reinforced heavy spears in hand. The 20 Swadian recruits had spread out around the dune, setting up guard posts. "All right." Kant nodded. He looked rather severe. "I guess 80 people would eat quite a lot of food." Chapter 9, Food Shortage. The people from the kingdom of Swadia were far from being frail and aged. All of them were stout, strong men who were in their prime. There was no way their food consumption would be a small amount. Outright impossible. If they were to calculate from that day onward, Drondheim's existing food storage would only last for 10 days. For Kant, that was a very huge headache. Is this a joke or something? If we run out of food and water, even at an oasis in the desert, we will definitely end up dead. There was another more important point he had to consider. There was no telling when the Jackalans would make their retaliation. With Drandheim still in a state of crisis and the storage of food within the fief being insufficient, Kant, as a newly appointed lord who was basically dirt poor, was practically in hell at the moment. The torture did not seem to be stopping any time soon. This really will be quite a trouble. Kant lowered his head and pondered the problem for a while. He knew just how serious the problem was. We need to solve the food shortage before anything else. He had made his decision. Whichever time or world he was in, any problem with food was the most pressing of problems, be it in reality, a game, or unfamiliar foreign world, which he found himself in at the moment. The problem was even more apparent to Kant. More than anything else, the people who were watching over Drondheim needed to see their bellies filled. In order to be able to withstand a Jackalan attack, they had to keep their stamina up. An empty stomach meant one could end up in a limp, lethargic state. That made even lifting weapons difficult, let alone fighting the Jackalans, who could appear at any time. Even the Swadian peasants needed to be strong enough to hold up their scythes to protect their village. "I definitely need to think of something." Kant frowned as he brainstormed. There was the option to cut down the distribution of food to make it last longer, but doing so would only cripple Drondheim in the long run. He absolutely was not able to make a decision that would put him in a further pinch. Without stamina, one was not able to fight. "Let's have a look at the storage room." Kant returned to the council hall. The militia followed behind him. The storage room was in a corner on the first floor of the hall, which was about 322 square feet. Loaves of bread, dried meats, and round cabbages were all laid out on the shelves. The air was filled with the fragrance of food. "Is this all we've got?" Kant frowned and looked rather displeased. A militia member answered, "Indeed, my lord, there is just this and nothing else." From the looks of things, the food supplies were more or less as reported by the militia: 500 loaves of bread, 250 dried portions of meat, and 100 cabbages. The breakfast they had just eaten: 16 loaves of bread, 5 dried pieces of meat, and 5 cabbages needed to be, without a doubt, taken out of the equation. As such, while it seemed they had a lot of food left, considering it filled the entire storage room, judging from the fact that they had 80 adults to feed 3 meals a day, as well as additional meals for the guards on night duty, the room full of food would still only last for 10 days. After all, the Swadians were all healthy, strong men. They needed huge amounts of food for all 3 daily meals. Worse still, given how his fief was still under development, the cost in stamina would be even greater, which meant an increased need for energy intake. Other than needing to secure ample amounts of food, said food needed to be diversified even further. Oh right. Kant lifted his head a little and said to the militia, "We do have quite a hefty amount of supplies left in the carriages." Everything stored in the carriages was supplies he had prepared back in the dukedom of Leo. The supplies included large amounts of food. Although they had consumed some while they were on their way to the Oasis lookout and some were taken by the knights for their trip home, they should still have had a hefty amount left. He had specifically purchased food that was heat tolerant and had long shelf lives. "We checked the carriages the night before," a militia member replied. "There are loaves of bread, smoked meats, and sausages, as well as some salt, sugar, and spices." Kant nodded and asked, "How much of that do we have left?" "With everything accounted for, it will be enough to last us 3 more days, the militia member answered. "Wait, what? Just enough for 3 more days?" Kant was baffled and found what he heard unbelievable. He had purchased 1 whole carriage full of food. At the time he purchased the food, he had considered the amount of food that would be consumed throughout their journey in the desert, as well as extra for their time developing the Oasis lookout when they settled down. It should have lasted the previous 30 Swadian peasants about half a month. "We checked everything and found that all of that will only last us 3 days, the militia member answered truthfully. Kant's brow was now locked in a deep frown. This was something he had not expected. "So, 13 days in total then?" Kant frowned. The militia member nodded and answered, "Correct." Kant's frown deepened after thinking about how much they ate during their journey. He was sure that he had not been eating much. When he recalled how the knights behaved when they left, he realized something. Kant gritted his teeth and said, "Those bastards. This has to be revenge." Those people were taking their revenge against him for having made them risk their lives to conquer the Oasis lookout, which had been taken over by the Jackalans. "You people really have won this time." Kant pinched his brow as he deeply sighed. However, it was pointless to be angry. After all, it had been his fault. He thought of his current predicament and the fief that was still being developed. He realized just how much of a difference there was between reality and an ideal. The troubles he currently faced made him feel rather helpless. He wondered just how much more trouble was waiting for him. "My lord," the militia member said, "it is best to get something to eat. Besides, breakfast is ready." A Swadian peasant, who served as the cook, approached them with a tray. On it was a huge wooden bowl that contained soup cooked with minced dried meat and cabbage and sprinkled with a dash of fine salt and pepper. There were also 2 slices of white bread as huge as a palm, which had been toasted and smelled very nice. "Yeah, breakfast does look good." Kant took the tray. He temporarily put all those troubles behind him since it was time for breakfast. The soup was thick, and the cooked dried meat and cabbage went well with the toasted bread. The fragrance of food permeated the entire oasis. The Swadian peasants were having a great time with their bread and soup. All of them were smiling excitedly and chatting away. They even laughed when someone said something funny or to be happy about. This was his fief. Kant liked the atmosphere of momentary relaxation amid the tense and busy state of things. This was the joy he had gained after leaving all that political clout back at the dukedom of Leo behind. It was especially so given how he was in charge of everything. The feeling of having all the power in his hands was intoxicating. Most people loved power. Few people liked living as hermits. Ambition. Whether they embraced it or not, it was something inherent in everyone. The food is very good. Thank the cook for me. Kant put down his knife and fork. He felt satisfied. After breakfast, his frown no longer looked all that severe. He was in a better mood. He left the council hall for the pond of the oasis to admire his fief and estate. He had divided the areas up beforehand. Mush! Kant did not watch his step closely enough. As he approached the pond, he seemed to have stepped onto something. The stench hit his nose before he had even lowered his head. He looked down. His usually calm face looked rather twisted. God damn it, this is disgusting. His leather boot had stepped onto a thick, sticky brown substance near the pond. It was excrement from the Jackalans. His twisted face became filled with seething hatred. He scanned the area near the pond and saw at least over 30 mines of such nature, which practically made the place seem like a minefield. The Jackalans, who were still in a primitive state, had no concept of hygiene or disease prevention. Truthfully, however, such primitive beings were usually immune from common illnesses. **T. Kant cursed and stepped away, rubbing his feet in the sand in an attempt to scrub off the disgusting pile of excrement sticking to his boot. A prompt from the system suddenly appeared on his retina. Ding, side quest assigned. Side quest, clean up the oasis. Reward, Flower X20. Introduction, your fief is located in the oasis, but the place is currently contaminated by the dirty Jackalans. Clean up your oasis. The place holds all of your future hopes. It was a system quest. Kant was slightly startled, but his eyes became filled with joy after seeing the introduction on his retina. It was enough to lighten his soiled mood from stepping on *T for quite some time. This is just what I need. What the Oasis lookout lacked most, and had a pressing need for at the moment, was undoubtedly food. Finishing the current side quest would reward Kant the food he desperately needed. Furthermore, it was 20 bags of flour, which could be used for making bread by just adding water. While 20 bags of flour were not a lot, they would give him a few more days to come up with a lasting solution. Kant would have better choices by then. Whether it required returning to the dukedom to purchase food or searching the deeper reaches of the desert for a way out, all of that would only be possible if he had the time to spare without having to worry about the food shortage problem getting in the way of his plans. Clean up the oasis. That is simple enough. Kant already had plans. Actually, he would have arranged for the Swadian peasants to clean the oasis up all the same, with or without that quest from the system. The Jackalans had made a giant mess of the oasis while they were living there. Trees? Kant was just about to arrange for the peasants to clean the place up when he caught sight of the desert poplar trees swaying in the wind at the northern side of the pond. The trees looked beautiful as the morning sun washed over their gently swaying branches. However, another type of tree appeared in Kant's mind. Date palm trees. They had been the reward acquired from finishing the side quest. All 20 date palm trees were ripe. Kant had finished 2 quests. He had crushed the team of Jackalans out to ambush them, and he had annihilated the Jackalan tribe. The 20 date palm trees and a desert bandit lair were acquired as rewards, respectively. All of that could be brought immediately to reality, just like how the council hall had materialized right before him the night before. Chapter 10, Value of the Date Palm Trees. Yeah, the date palm trees. Kant smiled. That was quite a pleasant surprise. In usual fertile flatlands suitable for human habitation, where plants of all types could grow and flourish, date palm trees were of little use. They usually only served as decorative plants in gardens or rare fruit trees that added a touch of exoticness to the menu of non-essential foods. In other words, date palm trees were basically non-essential and dispensable. However, to desert people, who survived in such a harsh, unforgiving environment, the tall, stout palm trees were indispensable plants they relied on to survive. Date palm trees were holy things born in the desert. Such was the status of the date palm trees. Kant knew that fruits born by such trees, the tasty, juicy dates, were where their essence lied. Dates were usually lauded as the most nutritious of dried fruits, which enabled them to earn the title of desert bread. 2/3 of the date fruit consisted of sugars. Ancient Egyptians saw the dates as signs of a good harvest, while Romans and Greeks used dates in victory celebrations to welcome their winning soldiers home. One date palm tree was capable of bearing 300 dates, and every date weighed about 20 grams each. These fruits were packed with extremely high nutritional value. They contained various vitamins and natural sugars. Furthermore, dates were sweet, juicy, and nutritious, making them useful either as a staple food or fruit. They could be used as ingredients for making sugars and liquor, as well as all manner of sweets, high-quality jams, biscuits, and dishes. They could also be used to make vinegar and pure alcohol. Their sugars and nutritional value were so high that an adult could maintain basic survival needs just by eating 6 dates per meal. It was a fruit that lived up to its title of desert bread. As such, for a very long time, the dates served as a staple food of desert people. They were an indispensable crop desert dwellers relied on for survival. Even in the system, it was a specialty of the Saran Sultanate and a tactical supply that maintained the desert kingdom's prosperity. That was because there was more than just fruit to the date palm trees. The plant itself was filled with treasures. Human civilizations had a use for every part. The trunks of the date palm trees were viable as construction materials and water tanks. The trees were aesthetic enough for use as decorative plants. Their twigs and vines were useful for crafting chairs and beds, as well as baskets for carrying fruits, vegetables, poultry, and fish. Their leaves were ideal for making mats, brooms, trays, and other such items. Those parts also served as fuel. The trunks were useful for crafting sheds and bridges, while the seeds could be used as feed. Low-quality dates were used as fertilizer or to feed for livestock. The trees were just as useful for making weapons. For instance, pole arms and siege engine parts were crafted using the trunks of date palm trees. In fact, common weapons used by desert people had parts that came from date palm trees. I need to be careful about this. Kant nodded silently as he scanned the Oasis lookout. The 50 Swadian peasants were hard at work around the pond that formed from the geyser of spring water. They were clearing up all manner of garbage and excrement left by the Jackalan tribe, gradually restoring the oasis to its original clean and tidy appearance. It was carried out by his orders so that he could acquire the reward of the side quest assigned by the system. Besides, 20 bags of flour were very important. The Swadian peasants were down to earth and hard-working, which put Kant at ease. At the moment, he needed to seriously consider how to divide the limited pieces of land at the Oasis lookout to ensure the steady development of his village, Drondheim, which, at the moment, only had the single council hall. The Oasis lookout was his most important estate, so he could not afford to be careless with it. Residential, commercial, agricultural, and crafts areas, all of which were regions available only to huge towns or cities, were something that he deemed necessary to be planned in the early stages. Otherwise, once the village was developed into something more, the messy city planning and construction would be an eyesore. He had the system to serve as his cheat, so he never thought he would have to stay trapped in the desert forever. The desert is not the end. The oasis shall serve as my foundation toward success. Kant muttered to himself. After looking around, he had thought of quite a few ideas. The spring water emerged from cracks underground, forming a pond. Kant estimated that the length between the eastern and western end was about 82 feet, while the width between the northern and southern end was about 19 feet. The geyser beneath was about 3 feet deep. It turned increasingly shallow as it reached the edge. It was a rare water source found in the desert, which formed the foundation of the Oasis lookout's existence. There were about 164 feet of land at the southern and northern sides of the pond that remained free from the desert's encroachment. A good number of tightly packed small green plants grew there. Several lush trees were scattered between all that greenery. On the north side of the pond, there were 6 thick and twisted desert poplar trees. They were located at the intersection between the oasis and the desert. The faint yellow leaves filled the branches and swayed in the wind, which looked as pleasant as finely dressed women dancing. Desert poplar trees were desert trees. They were of a status comparable to the date palm trees and known as the protector god of the desert. These trees played a vital role in stabilizing the ecosystem balance around the river areas of barren deserts. They prevented erosion and regulated desert climate and the formation of fertile soil for forestation. They served as natural barriers for agricultural development in desert regions. It seems like the northern side of the pond could serve as agricultural areas. Kant made up his mind. He circled the pond and walked toward the 5 desert poplar trees, where the intersection between the soil of the oasis and the desert lied. There seemed to be a very clear line drawn between the two areas. The northern side was filled with yellow sand while the southern side had sandy areas of slightly darker colors, which were filled with weeds of unknown types. That meant the soil beneath was wet and capable of being used for farming. As for the 6 desert poplar trees, they were growing outside in the loose sand. Kant walked up close and found those trees to be tens of years old. Their 20-foot-tall trunks seemed twisted, but the tops of the trees were incredibly lush. They blocked out sunlight from above, making the place beneath seem cool. So, that's how it works. Kant took out his short sword and dug a bit at the base of the trees. He made a mental note. The roots are absorbing water deep within the sand. The place is still close enough to the oasis and the pond, which means that this place is not extremely arid yet. The roots of desert poplar trees were capable of absorbing water as deep as 32 feet below ground. As such, when such a tree was found in the desert, one could determine that within 32 feet beneath the said tree there were rare water resources. However, the place they were at was the oasis lookout, which had a sweet, refreshing spring water source practically right at their sides. He thought, the 20 desert palm trees could be arranged like a jungle. Kant nodded as his eyes scanned the intersections between the desert and the oasis. He decided to plant all of the date palm trees there, just like how the desert poplar trees were planted. That made them a natural barrier against the winds, preventing the sands of the desert from spreading into the oasis, as well as solidifying the sands and soil beneath to serve as preparation for further farming efforts. Be it in reality or the system, whether it was the desert people or the Saran Sultanate, they all planted their flora in such a manner. Date palm trees were planted outside, and crops were planted inside. Under the protection of date palm trees, the crops planted would grow well in the oasis as long as there was ample irrigation. When the date palm trees and other trees formed forests of larger areas, sweet, fruitful vegetables and fruits could even be planted. There was currently no lack of fresh water resources in the oasis lookout. As such, even if the trees were planted at the edge of the desert, their roots could easily burrow several feet deep underground, absorbing water from the oasis. System: can the date palm trees be planted here? With the plans in place, Kant connected his mind to the system. The system instantaneously replied, "You may." At the same time, card-like date palm trees appeared in Kant's mind. Data streams started to spread in reality, appearing on the spots that Kant had wanted the trees planted. The data streams continued to spread. At the edge of the oasis lookout, 20 date palm trees were done being lined up in less than 2 minutes. Those date palm trees were all over 22 feet tall and looked like coconut trees growing on beaches. However, the fruits found on top of their tall, stout trunk were not huge coconuts. Instead, they were clusters of purplish-red dates, which were individually the size of an egg. They would turn red after being dried in the wind and could be stored for more than a dozen months at a time. "This is beautiful." Kant couldn't help but express his admiration. The date palm trees were tall and straight, and they formed a straight line along the intersection between the desert and the oasis. A breeze carrying heat blew across them, causing the palm trees, which had flat yet thin, long leaves, to sway in the wind. They seemed to have possessed a special charm, making them look like alluring women in the desert. Green plants all looked mesmerizing in a sea of sand because they symbolized survival. The appearance of the date palm trees attracted the attention of the peasants, as well as the soldiers on guard duty. They all joyfully gazed in his direction. Many peasants eyed the clusters of dates on those trees in a mesmerized manner. Their purplish-red skin meant that the dates were ripe for harvest. They would be very sweet and precious fruits. Even though the kingdom of Swadia was right beside the Saran Sultanate, those tasty dates would fetch a high price due to war and the existence of bandits. "I need 10 men to help me out," Kant called out. "We're of your service, my lord." There were 10 Swadian peasants packing up the broken tents. They quickly put down what they were doing and went over to where Kant was, awaiting orders. "I need all of you to pluck the dates," Kant said. "As you wish, my lord." The peasants looked up. The clusters of dates below the 22-foot-tall trunks were enticing. However, due to the height, it was impossible to effectively get them without appropriate tools. However, that was of no trouble to them. A peasant said, "There is a 20-foot wooden ladder in the council." "Yeah, and baskets on the roof," another peasant added. "Very well." Kant nodded in satisfaction and said, "I shall leave the task to you all." Then again, noting the current food shortage faced by Drondheim, he still cautioned them, "Be careful though. Don't scratch up the bark of these beloved fruits while you are at it. Otherwise, they won't last after being dried." The peasants shrugged and nodded affirmatively. "Rest assured, my lord." While they were not all that proficient at combat, they were very good at agricultural and all manners of menial labor.